Okay, so thank you very much, Maya, for setting us up, and welcome everyone to why threats and opportunities are similar but not opposite, and what you can do about it. And that's with me, Chris Ritson at Safran. So I've been working as a project risk manager for nearly 15 years now, and that's here in the UK civil engineering sector. And over those years, I've noticed a few elephants, and they keep reappearing, to coin a phrase. But what's interesting is that maybe a few of these elephants actually coalesce around the thinking and the practice of opportunity management. So just to give an example, I once worked with a senior manager who revealed to me that there is no contingency on this project because all 5 of the opportunities that they assessed counterbalanced the 50 plus identified threats. Now, I had so many questions about this. So were these 2 assessments created by 2 different people in isolation from each other? Were there genuinely no relationships or feedback loops between these 2 lists? What were the assumptions that underwrote such high value opportunities? And were they stable? Or was it just a convenient statement to pass through tender governance checks? And I guess I'll never know. So as you can imagine, trying to deliver all of those millions of capex with effectively 0 margin for error, I mean, it's just oversimplifications like this that have really triggered my curiosity over the years. And so when I joined Safran a year and a half ago now, I was invited to draft a blog for them. And this idea that opportunity management is being misunderstood and mishandled was a major contender. But a newfound colleague in Safran had actually already just written one, so it was on exactly this subject. So to be fair, Mark did a really good job on this, and I'd absolutely recommend that you circle back and read this one if you haven't done already. But when I was invited to speak at this event, I thought I'd see what else could be built on top of Mark's original article, as it's such a rich and diverse topic, as you've probably just been hearing from Carl. And indeed, I think there's maybe 3 other speakers as well at today's conference that are exploring this subject. So it's really excellent to see that opportunity management is receiving this level of attention. So my aim here isn't to duplicate Mark's work, but offer some additional insights from my own experience, but also provide some practical advice for what you can do. So I will assume that for many of you are already familiar with the concepts, the definitions of risk as outlined within the APM's own PRAM guide and the ISO 31000 guidance. Both essentially describe risk as having an uncertain outcome that may be beneficial or detrimental to achieving an objective, which is why threats and opportunities are often described as being 2 sides of the same coin. But in practice, this just isn't always the case. So what my personal observations for why teams can get so muddled when trying to consider the abstract nature of risk? Well, it's about the difficulty in creating and sustaining a mental model that represents the project outcomes that you idealistically hope for, and at some deeper level are trying to maintain control of, whilst also being cognizant or cognitively dissonant to the likely actual outcomes due to foreseeable risk. And we're just going to park the unforeseeable risk to one side for now. But really, we're looking at 2 foundational building blocks: the logic to create these models and the language to describe the models to others. And then there's this 3rd factor, cultures. Now, it's the cultures that shapes what is permissible behavior, both in terms of what ideas are acceptable or how much time and resource will be provided or withheld, and how best to communicate these ideas with different internal and external stakeholders. So when you recognize that your project is probably both complex with lots of interdependent relationships and is inherently full of uncertainties that may affect other connected parties, this becomes a melting pot of ideas and possibilities which necessitates the need for computer simulation. Now, computers aided with Monte Carlo simulation will enable us to hold multiple possible futures side by side to assist decision making. And let's not forget, The academic research and books such as Black Box Thinking remind us that our brains don't cope very well with 4 or more moving variables held in tension with one another. And most people are comfortable with handling just, say, 3 bits of information, like the classic cost times scope triangle. But even a highly trained captain in charge of a commercial aircraft with all kinds of dashboard metrics to help them fly their plane safely, they're still going to require a co-pilot, an engineer, an air traffic controller to spread the cognitive load of dedicated tasks on behalf of that pilot. And that becomes especially true during the high-risk phases of flight and emergency situations. So if your mental model of how your project is supposed to run is being challenged by multiple competing stakeholders and they're prioritizing different things, and then say you've got those 50 threats and those 5 opportunities that can make further changes on top of that, then I'd suggest that most people just don't have the bandwidth to really consider them all realistically. And if they did, they really ought to be collaborating together and using computer assistance to outsource the heavy lifting. So when we look at both the logic and the language of opportunities through the lens of standardized processes and tools, something curious happens. Everyone is suddenly nudged to treat things in a particular way, which is exactly what is expected, but this isn't necessarily helping. A one-size-fits-all approach will tend to ignore the nuance of a particular context. So, for example, when a project is in its early conception phases, there's generally more time to explore multiple ideas that optimize delivery for efficiency. Minimum capital's been expended, so there's little commitment to any particular idea, and there's still a time window in which senior managers can change their mind or pivot to meet an unforeseen stakeholder's need. So blue sky optioneering can really take place here. But try to do this same thing mid-execution with boots on the ground, plans in place and briefed, contracts awarded, and suddenly a good idea, no matter how good it is, can become quite an unwelcome thing. So if you're in the habit of mid or near complete project reviews for lessons learned, then I'd suggest this might be a better forum to capture those opportunities, e.g., what might you do better next time? But when we look at the process of continual improvement and refining an existing plan or method, if we attempted to assess these via a standard PID matrix, then this tool would typically advocate not bothering, which tends to be the opposite message sent from senior managers in the client organizations. But clearly, people like Jeff Bezos disagrees and will happily invest hundreds of safe to fail experiments, knowing that the 1 in 100 that pays off, it will tend to pay off big, and it will have enough to cover the cost of the less successful trials and those outright failures. So organizations like Amazon aren't optimizing for efficiency to begin with. They're keeping an open mind to the bigger picture to discover what's effective and then make that idea more efficient later once they have a proof of concept. But what the tech giants and ordinary people implicitly know and explicitly acknowledge is the true relationship between risk and reward. And to me, on projects, I feel like this is something that we've conditioned ourselves to unlearn, yet instantly we remember it when we're engaging in our domestic lives, like with things with which road to take en route or tube line, or of course in sports as the other one. So do you overstretch in pursuit of a goal? Do you take the corner too fast in Formula One, or leave yourself exposed to counterattack from the opposing team? Essentially, you must be prepared to put something on the table and risk losing it in order to gain something that you do not yet have. And on projects, particularly those that have high value, high reputational scrutiny, the very notion of having weakness is often undesirable, but to voluntarily invite potential weakness is practically taboo. So playing it safe, by the word and to the letter of the contract, no more and no less, is often adopted to keep the auditors and the litigators at bay. And the construction industry often have low profit margins to protect as well. So all of these incentives drives behavior, and it drives it from a place of fear. So let's take a look at what people say about fear and how that can affect things. So Brené Brown says, when perfectionism is driving, shame is riding shotgun, and fear is that ignoring backseat driver. she also goes on to say that shame becomes fear, and fear leads to risk aversion, and risk aversion kills innovation. Bonus points for anyone that read that last one with a sort of Yoda voice. But she also continues to underlie this point that she says there's no innovation and creativity without failure, period. And if we invite the late great Sir Ken Robinson, he'd also volunteer that if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. And a system that values obedience over curiosity isn't education, and it certainly isn't science. And of course, there's no higher authority on the subject than Star Trek's Captain Jean-Luc Picard, where he says it's possible to commit no errors and still lose. That's not weakness, that's life. So actually, there's this connection here between fear of failure, or perhaps more accurately, a fear of blame culture, and our ability to feel the freedom to be curious, serendipitous, and truly creative. And if we can't be creative, then it minimizes the number of opportunities identified and pursued, and thus leaves uncaptured value on the table. So when I used to get challenged by the client's representatives midway through project execution, they'd say things like, I see there's lots of threats on your risk register, but where are all the opportunities? But the answer was often really quite simple. Your organization requested the most efficient possible delivery sequence. We worked with you to craft what that could look like. You rejected some of those ideas, and the ones that you liked were effectively baked into the latest works information, and the revised schedule's been agreed, and the associated risks have been reflected in the risk register. So therefore, the opportunity's already been escalated out of the risk register and incorporated into the plan. So please monitor the performance of the opportunity directly from the schedule, not from the risk register. It's just not there anymore. So what is interesting is that once all of the credible opportunities have been either implemented or the window to implement them effectively has been missed, then you're left with this mixture of luck and pure exposure to foreseeable and unforeseeable threats. And this perhaps is the ultimate outcome of lean thinking and over-optimization. If there's no fat and there's no waste left within the system to help absorb shocks, then the system will simply break. However, notwithstanding the law of diminishing returns, if you're happy to fund further upfront investments, preemptive mitigation measures against the remaining threats are also a form of indirect opportunity to enhance the chances of achieving project success and objectives. So a little bit more on that later. But we have to remember that other psychological factors are at play when calculating risk-reward payoffs, as it feeds into the fear of failure and blame culture that I believe is prevalent. So when calculating an opportunity, usually you can visualize and sense near exactly what you hope to achieve and understand the maximum utility that's up for grabs. Furthermore, if there are any additional unforeseen benefits that will come as either a second or third order consequence or consequential saving, then people are not going to complain if you miss these in your initial assessment. But as soon as you flip into threat assessment mode, the powers that be will want similar assurances on the maximum exposure, and now you have a problem, because most situations, risk owners can't foresee the potential chains of dominoes lined up and ready to fall over if the particular risk in question was to occur. And people inherently know that many risk exposures can often follow a log normal shape when the maximum worst case scenario is basically unquantifiable. But when comparing a few opportunities with their maximum benefits capped versus the unknowable infinite pain of foreseeable threats and their unforeseeable dependencies, it's only by operating a project management culture that's more akin to the just culture that's promoted by the health and safety discipline or the world's networks of air crash investigators that we can really expect to prevent project teams from spamming risk registers with hundreds of trivial threats because they don't want to be unfairly scapegoated for things beyond their direct control. And for more insight on this, I'd highly recommend the 1-hour quick read from Carol Osterwal, with particular emphasis on the project stress cycle. Okay, but what can you do today? So Looking at pragmatic solutions in turns out that the traditional risk management techniques and principles, such as wielding a proportionate level of effort to the scale of the issue being faced, also being supported by basic cost benefit analysis. You can do all this stuff to ever increasing levels of sophistication. So in the first place, you could just start, regardless of which risk register and which tools you're using, you just simply invert the calculus. So your risk management plan could stipulate that all threats with a probability greater than 50% are actually converted into expected events. And then you can describe on your activity schedule and then add an opportunity in the risk register in its place. So for example, if the threat has 70% chance of occurring, there would now be a 30% chance of it not happening, with the associated savings being sort of fully understood. But alternatively, we could look at how some Safran tools could help you prioritize your limited time and resource in an intelligent way. So let's start with cost-benefit analysis. If you're time poor, then Safran Risk Manager's real-time dashboard will perform a quantitative analysis on your pre and your post-treated positions for each risk on the register. This will then translate into a ratio score, which effectively means for every pound invested in upfront mitigation, how many pounds can I reasonably expect to save in the longer term? Solution 2 is to model your opportunities probabilistically. So as I suggested earlier, opportunities aren't going to magically make themselves occur. So if you expend no effort, you receive no reward. But also consider the personalities, the stakeholders, and the available budgets. Are your proposals likely to secure the required upfront investment? But also, is your proposal tried and tested or completely new to market? Is there a chance that things won't work out as hoped, even if we resource the proposal? The Monte Carlo can take all of this into consideration as part of the simulation logic, where it only yields the time and the cost payoffs when successfully passing through these two-step probability questions. Furthermore, if you've constructed a holistic and fully integrated cost and schedule risk model, the output reports will help you discern the direct and indirect benefits. And this works for both opportunities and threat mitigation proposals. And of course, don't forget, wherever possible, to communicate specifically to the scenario you're modeling, not just looking at the overall improvement to the whole project, but pick the appropriate schedule milestone or the CBS item and make the benefit explicit within that localized context, because it just really helps communicate. And finally, if you want to really raise your game and your team's delivery culture will support you with the extra time taken to model and explore some mission critical scenarios, then Safran Risk will also let you create event existence scenarios in the spirit of performing, say, like a pre-mortem analysis. So let me quickly explain what I mean by that. So whilst Monte Carlo simulation is a great approach, two potential new elephants will now join you. Change management, driven by third parties and or circumstances beyond the control of the project team, and how people tend to be incentivized to behave. Now, there are some predictable situations that can be accounted for up front. So, for example, if we were to execute a project and the program begins to slip, pressure to recover the situation is then typically exerted by stakeholders wishing to maintain that original position. Where we can sense the potential for that change in circumstance, we can actually model this as a probabilistic branch on the schedule. And where there is better understanding of the underlying causes, we may even be able to create a conditional branch of the schedule. Now, both of these are forms of preemptive what-if scenario planning for alternative successor activities that can actually render entire sequences redundant and replaced with new ones if needed. Okay, so in conclusion, I believe that project teams may need to revisit their culture around opportunities, as it shapes both the approach and defines what's acceptable. And my advice is to build truly collaborative cultures, which for me personally means trusting that the other contractual parties actually mean well, and they're not there to beat you up as soon as it's convenient for them to do so. So be transparent, celebrate the desired behaviors that you're trying to nurture. This is an organic thing. Think of a gardener that wants to attract butterflies or have butterflies in their garden. They don't just buy them from the shop. They actually have to put the work in to prepare the ground and plant the exact correct flowers that will continually attract the butterflies to visit and revisit. And it's just the same for drafting a continual supply of fresh and good ideas. My second point would be build computer simulations to help discern the complex relationships between different opportunity decision scenarios that are cognizant of the additional assumptions and the threats, and use them to compare probabilistic outcomes, communicate the full significance to the stakeholders, to help them make smarter or at least more defendable choices should things not quite turn out as hoped for. And then 3, don't rely on one-size-fits-all tools. Recognize what phase your project is in and use the right tool for the job. Risk managers should be able to help you with basic qualitative comparison, decision trees, lessons learned, influence diagrams, and and like the fully correlated simulations I've just been talking about, and bring those out to fit the need on a case-by-case basis. And you may also have innovation champions that could be great for helping with facilitation of unorthodox workshops or conducting those kind of pre-mortems that I mentioned. So I hope this has been thought-provoking and you're feeling like you want to come by and chat with us in our sponsored room. My colleagues and I will be here throughout the conference, and you can find it via this link in the top right-hand corner of the lobby. I do really feel like we're only scratching the surface with this particular iceberg, and there's probably a lot more to say. And as I said, Carl's presentation just before was really excellent on this subject as well. But as I said at the start, please also do read the original blog post by Mark Turner. We have a PDF version inside our sponsored room, and consider signing up for our user conference in May. And it would just be really great if you can reinvigorate the discussion around risk reward back into your respective projects. So thank you all for your time. I hope to speak to many of you later, and see you at next week's lunchtime slot, where I'll be demonstrating how Safran Risk makes it easier for you to perform integrated cost and schedule risk analysis. And thanks again to the APM for inviting us to speak here. Thank you.